talked about the rotation of the planet Mercury and how peculiar it was, and how it was resolved ultimately by radar, planetary radar. And it got me to remembering some personal connections I had through my mentor and through Haystack to another important radar result involving Mercury and Venus, actually. So back in 1915, this gentleman, who most people recognize when he's older, Albert Einstein, gave out probably his most famous result, which is his theory of general relativity, or his theory of gravity. And this was a real blockbuster prediction where he unified what we knew about gravity and made several predictions with his mathematical framework that was really revolutionary at the time. And he made three predictions at the time, and they were the first prediction was that the orbit of Mercury would be precess at a certain rate. That is, that the egg-shaped orbit the orientation of it would move around with time, as you see here in this image. The second prediction, and that was actually already known that it did, but general relativity explained why it did that. The second prediction that he made was that light would be bent by gravity. As it goes through space, gravity warps space and it causes light to bend. And that it's a small amount of bending, at least for something like the sun. Of course, it's far, far more for a black hole, but didn't know about them back in 1915. And he made a prediction that starlight going right by the limb of the sun would be deflected by about 1 3/4 seconds of arc, which is a very small angle. A very hard measurement. You need to blot the sun out so you can see the stars. And so he predicted that this would happen. So the next time there was a solar eclipse in 1919, they went out and measured the positions of the stars, and sure enough, they had shifted near the sun by a little bit, just by the amount that Einstein predicted. And he had a third test, which I won't go into here, which had to do with gravitational redshift, which is a result of time slowing down when you're further down in a gravity well. I'd be happy to discuss that with you offline. And that's how it stayed for about 50 years, until my professor that got me involved in astronomy and I worked for many years and has been a colleague, Erwin Shapiro, came up with a fourth test, which is now called the Shapiro time delay. And he realized that radio waves, or light waves, but radio waves as they go past the sun would also suffer a delay. And it's really a consequence of the similar parts of the equations that cause the light to take a circuitous path around the sun. And that actually causes a delay. So what he realized also was that it could be tested, because this was just about the era when the planetary radars came online. So they fired up the planetary radar at Haystack Observatory, where I spent my scientific career, and pointed it at Venus and Mercury throughout the year, but in particular as they both went behind the sun, close to the sun. And they measured the round trip time delay as the radar signal went from the Earth to Mercury, Venus, and then back again, and saw, compared that to what they would expect if this space were nice and flat and there was nothing funny going on. That is, just due to the shape of the orbits, what would they expect the time delay to be? And sure enough, they saw this extra time delay that matches the predictions that you see on the curve here. And as you get up close to the sun, it gets up to almost 200 microseconds, which is actually quite a bit of time delay, and then comes back down. 200 microseconds is, let's see, about 60 kilometers of equivalent distance. So it's as if the light round trip had to go an extra 60 kilometers on its path and showed up that much later. But it was quite a special result for Erwin, and kind of really made his mark. And eventually he became left at MIT and went to Harvard to be an astronomy professor there, and the chairman of the astronomy department, and also the head of the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory for many years. and he's now retired from that, but I still see him from time to time. And not the least of which, he's just a great guy, and he used to even play softball on the team with us. We had a team called the Nine Planets back when there used to be nine. I think there's still 9 people on a softball team, but anyhow, 9 planets, and he would play with us, and it was all a good time, and we enjoyed it. So that's it for the radar astronomy. On to the chess. Well, on to the chess. I'm afraid I didn't sleep very well last night, so who knows how sharp this analysis will be. But I played Brett Kildahl on board one, and he's been a very tough opponent for me in the past, and continued to be a tough opponent again last night. So, you can take a look at Brett's analysis and you probably see something a bit more cheerful on his side. But hopefully I can shed a little light on what I did wrong. So it was I had prepared for the game, looking at his online games and seeing what things he seemed more comfortable in and less comfortable in. And I decided to go with an e-pawn opening because the double king pawn openings especially, he professes not to be too comfortable with. He gets an okay position, but I think that it was probably a good choice on my part. What happened after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5? Okay, we reach a Giuoco piano position, and my intention was to continue with the line, which is quite popular these days, a sort of Giuoco Pianissimo, they call it, that it is actually being played quite a bit at the top levels. And so we went right down that line. I castled, he attacked my e-pawn, and I defended it just with d3, which is, of course, not the what used to be the main line of playing the Giuoco piano, which was to back in this position, instead of castling, playing c3, and then the pawn gets attacked, and white instead doesn't respond to that, plays d4, and the pawns are exchanged, and black checks, and white blocks it. And there's a whole body of theory that goes along with this. But this is a position that black has plenty of defenses for. So rather than that, I played this idea that where instead of committing myself in the center, at least that's the idea, I was going to play d3 and c3 and grab space on the queen side. So after d3, he protected his king pawn. I played c3 to prevent his knight, well, for a couple of reasons, but of course one is to prevent the knight from coming into d4 at some point, particularly if he were to go ahead and pin my knight. And also to enable the pawn move b4 with the idea of continuing with a4 and grabbing a lot of space on the queen side. And in this kind of development, usually the knight, the b knight comes to d2. Often after the rook comes to e1, the knight comes over to f1 and then back up to g3. That's one of the kinds of formations you can play as white in this position. And I had ideas of doing that, but as you'll see, it never actually got there. In this position, I could play h3 and prevent the pawn, the pin. But this pin is kind of toothless for white, because I can just, say after I played c3, if he went ahead and pinned me, I can just go ahead and defend with the knight. And now at my leisure, I can do things such as driving this bishop away, maybe bringing the knight to f1 and g3 and attacking the bishop if it's on h5. After b4, I can play the I can play my queen to b3 rather, gaining tempo and breaking the pin, at least if he hasn't castled yet. So all sorts of possibilities. It's really not a very worrisome pin. So that's why you don't worry about playing h3 immediately. So played c3. He responded with h6 because my pin could be a problem if he allowed me to play bishop g5. I continued on with a4. At this point, I I thought about various possibilities, and as I show in my notes there, one of the things I considered was an immediate b4 when he's pretty much obliged to move back with the bishop. Sorry about all the noises in the background. And I could continue on with a4. He would either have to play a6 or a5. Probably a5 is the mechanically stopping my pawn from going further is most reasonable. And then I can push it with my b pawn and drive his knight away. And I develop my knight, and he castles. And, you know, this is a little bit better for white. I have more space than black has. And to be honest with you, I would have liked this position better than when I got in the game. The bishop can develop possibly to a3. It'll be easy to centralize the rooks. The queen could go to b3. It's a nice easy game for white, and there's no immediate threat of a big attack on white's king side, although he'd have to be a little careful about that because that's where black clearly has his forces going. Okay, so I did not do that. Instead, I chose a different plan, which is to play a4, threatening to play b4, trapping the bishop if he doesn't do anything about it. You know, if he did something foolish like castling, then b4, the bishop has to retreat, and now it's dead. Okay, so what I expected his response, a5, and now I've weakened this b5 square here, his control over it. And at some point, I figured I'd either be able to play my bishop there, or possibly more likely my knight. Particularly if it went through this path, it could get up there quite easily. But I never really got to play through there. I got in this position. I looked at it for a while and really liked the idea of grabbing the center. It looked reasonable to me, and I think it was a flawed concept. But you know, one that at the time the flaws weren't obvious to me. Being an old e-pawn player, you know, I really like that d4, e4 pawn center against black's center, and it becomes, as you'll see, I get a nice center, but it becomes a target. What I probably should have done is just develop more quietly. The problem is if you look at this position and you know, kind of take stock, I have 3 developing moves that I've developed my bishop and knight, and I've castled. And he's made 3 developing moves with his 3 minor pieces. Okay, so tempi are even. I have a little bit more central control with my pawns than he has, so that's an advantage for me. And that's sort of what I based my idea of you know, playing d4 immediately. The other thing is I saw that his king was still in the center, and if his king were stuck in the center, that would be an issue. But the problem is that in all of these lines, he's able to, you know, just castle out of trouble in one move, and there's no way to really take advantage of the fact that his king is in the center. And so playing d4 was premature, and I should have just gone ahead and at this point and developed my knight through d2 and gotten into some sort of, you know, reasonable positional game doing that. But I didn't. Instead I played pawn to d4. And after this, he surprised me a little. I thought he'd just retreat his bishop, and that was what was chosen in 32 games in the database that I looked at. But he actually traded off pawns, which I think is probably not his best. He traded off his e pawn basically for my c pawn, and then retreated his bishop. And now I've got the really strong pawn center, d4 and e4, against his pawn on d6, and I was feeling pretty good. But I think it was a bit of a mirage, that it's really not as good as it appears. And particularly after my next move, h3, it allows him a simple move of castling, which all of a sudden I realized I was in a tough spot here, and I thought for 18 or 20 minutes, something like that. And the problem is, I saw his move coming up, but I couldn't find any way to avoid it, any way that I liked to avoid it. I saw some ways to avoid it, but they didn't appeal to me. So one way to avoid what's coming up, and I'll show you that in a minute, is to play d5. Um, but he centralizes knight, and after the exchange now, I maybe have a slight edge here, but I really didn't like my deep. I didn't like my d pawn, my pawn structure, right? My d pawn being a bit overextended there, where it could be I get attacked by c6, pawn break there. And the other problem, of course, is that I was very reluctant to open up this the bishop's eyes looking at f2, and so I didn't want to do that. And what I didn't like about knight c3, which I eventually played, so I could have done that instantaneously because that's what I had planned on playing, a move prior to this. I opened up the pawn square opened up with the pawn exchange, and normally knight c3 is very nice. But the problem, of course, is the fork trick, which is very common. He just goes ahead and takes the pawn with his knight, and now if I take the knight back, he advances his pawn, forking my two pieces. And I can either drop the bishop back and take on e4, but that has problems because it blocks the defense of my d pawn. Or I can take the pawn and he takes back with the queen, and then I have to do something here. If I just defend my knight, the pawn on d4 is going to hang. So instead, I win a tempo back playing knight c3, and his queen has to move. But I didn't like positions like this. Queen could go a few different places, but it looked to me like black had solved all his problems. I have this isolated d pawn that's a real target of his pieces. I just didn't like looking at the future position. I didn't like the looks of this. So kind of impulsively, I went ahead and sold my bishop dearly with a desperado on f7, and then took back that way. And so material's even. I've given him an exchange of given him an exchange for my weakened d pawn, and I'm putting this wrong. And following this line that I did, I allowed him to get an open, half-open f file here for his rook. Right? It's bearing down either on f3 or possibly on f2, with possibly the bishop bearing down on that square at some point. But in exchange for that, I've weakened his king's position. This light square diagonal is open, and I thought maybe I could make use of that the queen at some point soon would come out to b3 and grab a hold of that light square diagonal going to his king. Sorry for all the arrows. And he would, either be leaving the rook pinned, or he would have to move, because he can't move the king away, and so he would have to defend the rook and then move the king away. It seemed like maybe I would get something out of this position, a little bit more than the other possibility, just allowing of taking back in the center. But this is flawed, like a lot of my ideas in this game. And after I took on e4, and he plays bishop f5, it's just, the play is just too easy for him. He's got the pair of bishops and a very open position and lots of lines, two open, a totally open e file, a half open f file, and it just becomes easy for him. I attacked the bishop. He retreated to h7. This gave me time to develop a little bit more and defend my weak d pawn, but this is, really not the game that I'm looking for. I momentarily, in this position, before I played bishop d3, I looked at the idea of d5, but of course, the problem there is that after he moves the knight, all I've succeeded in doing is opening up this diagonal for his bishop. the dark squared bishop. So that didn't appeal to me. Instead, I posted my bishop on that diagonal before I did anything, and of course he didn't allow me a later chance then to once I bolstered my diagonal, he didn't allow me a chance to move that d pawn. So he pushed his d pawn, I think, which is a good move. I played rook to c1, which I think is not great. The reason for that was, well, twofold. One was that I was looking at his possibility of playing knight to b4 to c2. I didn't like his knight coming into the position, where it's supported very strongly by this light squared bishop. And so by playing my rook here, I preemptively took control of this c2 square. But the other idea is that I had, which I think was a little faulty, was that I would be exerting pressure on the c7 pawn by being on that half open file. It's not a great idea because his rook is going to sit there for a while and be controlling it. His bishop, once the knight moves, he can just push the pawn forward and have a strong pawn formation over there. So it's not really a great square for my rook. So that I play a lot of weak moves in this game. And Brett played quite solidly. He played queen to d6. In fact, if you look at the lead chess valuation of the game, it looks a lot like last week's game, where it's just kind of a seafloor where it gets worse and worse and eventually falls off. There's no real sudden. There's certainly no large inaccuracies on Brett's part, and I just keep getting outplayed basically. So after queen d6, I developed my queen. b3 might have been a better square. I considered it, at least keeping an eye on his pawn. But here I had vague ideas of maybe putting pressure on the h6 pawn, but with my battery. But it's that's not going to happen. He has it adequately defended with his g pawn and his queen or possibly his rooks. He played his rook to e8, which surprised me a little bit. I expected it to go to f8. And I momentarily toyed with ideas now of things like rook to e1, so that if he did nothing, I could do a discovered attack with bishop to. Well, actually, I'm sorry. It wasn't the. That's the wrong rook. It wasn't the f rook. It was redeploying my c rook to e1, and then if he did nothing, I could play bishop to f4, attacking his queen and at the same time attacking his rook on the back rank. It's very easy to meet. He could double rooks on either the e file or the f file, either way. So that wasn't a good idea. Instead, what I did was to play knight to e2, which was trying to take over control of this f4 square, but that doesn't work out too well for me either. Frankly, there's not a lot of great moves in this position. I think moving the c rook to a more active square is probably my best move, but it's just it's a difficult position for white, and it's just going to get worse. I mean, it's a tough game. So I played knight to e2, and that allows him, and I realized that this would happen, that it allows his bishop to come into e4. So back when I had my knight here on g3, of course I was keeping that square under wraps, keeping that, both of these light square, both of those light squares under control from his bishop. And it was part of the reason for going to g3 in the first place. And I realized I'd be giving that up, but I felt that after he played bishop to e4, that my bishop to f4, if he played bishop to e4, that my bishop to f4 would be a strong rejoinder. And that, I was kind of clawing my way back here, and now I would start to actually have some chance of working my minor pieces into e5. But this it just tactically it doesn't work. It's as I mentioned in my notes there, the game is in a very concrete phase here, and it's you have to analyze the tactical lines correctly, and none of those really work out too well. I think at this point, what Stockfish suggested is just playing knight back to e1. Of course, his threat was here is to, well, actually right now it's to win a pawn with bishop takes knight, pawn takes, rook takes. And I could move my knight. I thought about moving it back to h2. I didn't like that. I actually, frankly, I also thought about going to let's see. Sorry, I thought about Stockfish's move playing the knight to e1, but I didn't really like that either. But apparently, it works out better than my move. It at least keeps the major damage from being done. So the problem with going to f4 is that he just moves his queen, and now I felt that I would be able to, just about any of the squares he went to, whether it was f6 or g6 or whatever, I could attack with my knight, that his queen would become a target out here if it tried to stay active. But it really doesn't. I played my knight into e5, and he simply exchanges there, allowing me to take back with my bishop, which is a mistake. And, right here, taking back, I considered taking back with a pawn, but I felt that was, positionally very bad because of the opening up his bishop to f2. And, I mean, he's just got very active pieces here, and of course he'll have to move his queen. But he's getting a after queen to g6 or something like that. He's getting quite a dominating position. I had to do it. I was lost, losing positionally here. I didn't want to go into this positional loss, and so I tried to muddy the waters tactically. But if I'd been on my game, maybe I would have seen that this just doesn't work out. Because after queen to g6, he's threatening checkmate now, and the game is going to be over fairly soon here because of these just very strong threats he has on my king side. And there are a lot of ways to go wrong. So a stupid way to go wrong would have been to play knight to f4, and I'll let. So I'll let you see. Oh, actually, sorry. Don't look. If you haven't looked, you might want to stop and see what can happen here that is very bad for white. Black to play here and win even more powerfully. There's a nice tactic, which is to go ahead and play rook takes f4. Actually, I missed a move here in my explanation. There's instead of moving his queen, he actually had an even stronger rejoinder, which was to play rook takes immediately on e5. I looked at this in my analysis and during the game, and I felt that after pawn takes, and he would have the sufficiency of bishop takes on f2 check instead of moving his queen right away. And I thought that after king to h1 that maybe this was a problem for him because of the pin and his queen being under attack. But I was hallucinating because he simply takes the pawn, and where's the problem? Where's the beef? I mean, this is nothing but a good position for black. And so instead he played queen to g6, but this also wins, even though it's not quite as strong. But like I said, if I play queen to f4, so rook takes f4. Sorry for the mental confusion here. It's still early. It's 8 a.m. or something, so I'm still waking up here. So rook takes f4. The mate threat's still on, basically. And So, you know, if I take back either way, he checkmates me, right? So it's just a lost piece. So instead, I played queen to g3. Queen to g3 is a very bad move. A better move would have been to play the bishop here, or even g3 would have been a better move, but playing the bishop back, at least I don't lose immediately, although, you know, black is totally dominating the position, will win in pretty short order. But after the move I played, rook to g3, even though I've mechanically black to checkmate, you know, what I was thinking at the time was, well, he doesn't have time to push his h-pawn and make my knight move, because I'm simply going to take his bishop off on the next chance I get, next move. But the problem is that never happens. And as soon as I made my move, I saw that he had rook takes bishop. And now this, you know, I am totally lost here. If I take the rook back, it's mate in a couple moves. If I don't take the rook back, I'm down a piece, and he's got, you know, every advantage. There's just no way to come up with any counterplay. So I suppose I ought to show how that mate happens. If I were so foolish as to take the rook, okay, he just takes my knight. And not only has he won a piece, he's won 2 pieces for the rook right now, which is bad enough, but there's also no way to stop checkmate on g2, right? So he's going to mate me here next move. This pawn is pinned on f2, so it can't move. And so the only way to stop checkmate is to play the queen to g5. And after the computerish kind of move, throwing away the queen is over, then now he's going to get, now white gets mated on the next move, you know, whatever move you make. There's mate on g2. So that's going to happen. Instead, I resigned after he, in this position, after he took my bishop on e5, and, you know, Stockfish agrees. The val at that point is around -8, and it's just, you know, the game is totally hopeless. So Brett played a very good game. I played a very disappointing game. So 2 out of my 3 losses since last summer in you know, the current championship year have been to Brett. So he's been a tough customer for me, and he's a stronger player than I am, but he's not that much stronger, and I shouldn't lose every single game to him. And it's getting into my head. I got to figure out some way to to do a better job of handling him. Anyway, that's it. I'm glad you stayed through the painful time if you did, or sorry for you if you did. And I'll see you next week at the club. Bye-bye.